Hey everybody, good to see you again. This is Steve Alcott, the intern pastor at Christ King Lutheran Church. I'm really excited we're able to partner together and do these videos, do Lenten series together. This is just fantastic. I have a big question for you. I want you to think about this for a second, but what does radical forgiveness look like? You know, we hear the word radical a lot. We hear things like radical Islam, and we might think our politics here in the United States or elsewhere is radical, but what about forgiveness? What does radical forgiveness look like? So you think about that as we talk a little bit. We looked at this past Wednesday, we talked a little bit about Joseph, and we looked at the very end of Genesis. And maybe you remember Joseph a little bit. He was the youngest in his family. His father made him this great, beautiful robe to wear, and of course his brothers were jealous. And his brothers were jealous of something else too. You see, he had this dream, and in his dream he dreamed that he was the ruler over his family. And obviously his brothers weren't too crazy about this, and so they did what probably every big brother dreamed about doing to their little brother, which is to sell him off as slaves. So that's what they do. They sold him to be a slave. And in the midst of being sold off as a slave, something kind of magical, amazing, pretty cool happens. He rises in the ranks in power, and he ends up becoming a governor in Egypt. And it's a pretty cool story. If you haven't read it, you should check out the end of Genesis that tells you about it, because something amazing happened. His brothers had to go to Egypt to get some grain. And in the midst of that, they bowed down to the ruler. They didn't even know it was their brother, but they bowed down to him, and his dream came true. So our text for this past Wednesday picks up at the very end of Genesis, chapter 50, starting with verse 15. It says, "When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, 'What if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrongs we did to him?' So they sent word to Joseph saying, 'Your father has left these instructions before he died. This is what you are to say to Joseph. I ask you to forgive your brothers the sins and the wrongs they committed in treating you so badly. Now please forgive the sins of the servants of the God of your father.' When their message came to him, Joseph wept. His brothers came to him and threw themselves down before him. 'We are your slaves,' they said. But Joseph said to them," and I want you to catch this because this is huge. He said, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children." And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them. What a great story that is about forgiveness. I mean, this text that we have about love, radical forgiveness from Joseph. He didn't have to do that. I don't know that I could have done something like that. What do you think? I mean, there's that great line in there that says, "You intended this for harm, but God intended it for good." Do you think that's Joseph just being kind of a glass half full kind of a guy? Or was there something more going on? Got a couple of questions for you guys to look at. So whether you're in a small group and you're going to talk about it as a discussion time, go ahead and do that now. Or if you're doing this at home, take a peek and you'll be able to see some questions that we have. It'll be attached with these files. But take a peek and look at the questions and think about this for a few minutes. We'll see you in a few. Welcome back. Hopefully you had a chance to think about times in your life where you needed forgiveness and times also where you needed to extend forgiveness. I think this is part of the walk of Christ, is being forgiven and forgiving others. I mean, we pray this in our prayers. This is part of our faith walk, isn't it? I was thinking about a story in which not only was there forgiveness, as we've seen in the text with Joseph, but a story where there was also faith in that forgiveness, that there was a hope and a trust placed in the forgiveness. You see, that's the cool thing about this story that we have with Joseph, is that line where it says, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good." I mean, that's a statement of faith right there. That's a hope and a trust in the Father. And reminded me of a story from a couple of years ago. I went to a graduation party, or was it a confirmation party? I think it was a confirmation party. But I went to a confirmation party, and at the confirmation party, the house was gorgeous. They had decorated everything. The place was gorgeous. Everything was perfect. And as we walked downstairs to this place where the party was going to be, you could see nothing was out of place. I mean, everything was The murals were perfect. Everything was great. Except there was this really large big screen TV in the back of the room, and it had a giant crack mark in it, a huge shatter all the way through. And it just kind of stuck out like a sore thumb. They tried to decorate around it, but it was like that. It was absolutely, unfortunately, a focal point of the room. And I remember going, oh man, what happened? And the father came over and he put his arm around the son and he said, my son broke the TV. And he said, and I remember looking at him, I go, oh my gosh, oh, you must have been grounded you must have been in so much trouble. Oh, are you let out of the house? I made jokes, and his dad put his arm around him again and said, nope, my son made a mistake and he has been forgiven. Now, the coolest thing about this is as he shared the story of what happened, a soccer ball and kids playing and all this stuff that had gone on, the son never shrunk down. The son never looked to the ground and thought, oh man, I really did mess up. You see, they had had a conversation in which he was forgiven. And he knew he was forgiven. He just stood there and embraced this forgiveness. And so as his dad retold the story, there was no more shame. There was no more frustration or even guilt that he had felt. He knew he was forgiven. And I think this is so important because you see, the cross, this is precisely what our God has done for us. You are forgiven because of the death and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And those sins that we hold, those things that we feel guilty about, they're gone. They're removed. It's like a robe, a beautiful robe that the Father has given us, this Jesus of ours, that we wear proudly, that we can boldly proclaim to others that we are forgiven. You see, Jesus on the cross, and we don't want to get too ahead of ourselves here for Lent, but Jesus on the cross does something so powerful. He looks down upon those that intended to do him harm, and he prays for them. He says, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And that forgiveness is just as much for you as it was for them. This radical forgiveness that our God has given us is for you. So put on that robe today, that robe of forgiveness. Wear it and share it with those around you. Thanks for coming. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you guys again soon. Take care and God bless.